Imagine the moment when the most feared man in Europe hears the words he never expected. Britain has declared war on Germany. Inside the Reich Chancellery, the generals wait for an explosion of rage. But something entirely different happens. Witnesses describe a silence so heavy it froze the entire room. Hitler, who believed the British would never fight, suddenly realizes his greatest miscalculation. What did he say? How did he react? And why did this single moment change the entire course of the Second World War? This is the day Hitler understood the war had slipped out of his control. In the early hours of September 3rd, 1939, Berlin was wrapped in a thin mist, the kind that lingered over the government district before the sun had fully risen. Inside the Chancellery of the Reich, the mood was tense but controlled. Adolf Hitler had awakened before dawn, as he did on most crucial military days, and had already gathered with several members of his high command. The invasion of Poland, launched just 2 days earlier, was progressing rapidly. Reports arriving through teleprinter lines described German armored units cutting deep into Polish defenses, while the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. From a purely military standpoint, the campaign appeared to be unfolding exactly as Hitler had predicted. Yet beneath this veneer of early triumph, there was an unspoken pressure, an unignorable countdown that every man in the room understood. The previous night, the governments of Great Britain and France had issued formal ultimatums. If Germany did not withdraw its troops from Poland, the Western powers would declare war. To Hitler, who believed he understood British psychology better than most of his diplomats, these warnings were empty threats. He had repeatedly insisted that the British lacked the will to engage in another large-scale European conflict. The memory of the First World War's devastation was, in his view, enough to restrain them. By mid-morning, Hitler moved through the halls of the Chancellery with hands clasped behind his back, pacing with short, deliberate steps. Officers followed at a cautious distance. Those present later recalled that he was unusually quiet. Preoccupied, yes, but not visibly distressed. He said several times, almost to himself, "The English will not go to war over Poland. They cannot." His confidence, at least outwardly, remained intact. Outside, Berliners went about their routines with growing anxiety. Radios in cafes and apartment windows broadcast speculation, but nothing official. People stood in clusters on sidewalks, listening for updates. Many had relatives in the military. Others remembered the hunger and collapse of the German Empire 2 decades earlier. The tension was palpable. At 9 a.m., Sir Neville Henderson, the British ambassador to Germany, arrived at the Chancellery to deliver Britain's final reply. The ultimatum's deadline, 11 a.m. Berlin time, was approaching. Henderson was solemn, fully aware of the gravity of his task. After a brief meeting with the German Foreign Office, he left the building. He knew, and the German leadership knew, that no withdrawal from Poland would occur. 2 hours later, as clocks in Berlin struck 11 so, a voice crackled over the BBC. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, speaking from 10 Downing Street, announced that Britain was now at war with Germany. The message was calm, firm, and unambiguous. There would be no negotiations, no further warnings, no reprieve. The announcement reached the Chancellery within seconds. A staff officer entered the room where Hitler was seated with several of his ministers. According to later testimony, the officer spoke quietly. "My Führer, Britain has declared war." For a long moment, no one reacted. The air seemed to thicken. Hitler did not erupt in anger, nor did he rise from his seat. Instead, witnesses recalled an extraordinary stillness. He leaned back slightly on the sofa, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the room. Albert Speer, who was present, later described Hitler's expression as one of profound disappointment, almost resignation. It was as if the weight of an enormous realization had settled on him. This reaction stands in stark contrast to the fiery image often portrayed in later dramatizations. In reality, Hitler had been convinced by his own judgment and by the assurances of his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, that Britain would never intervene militarily for Poland. He believed the political rifts and economic hardships of Europe would prevent such a decision. The news, therefore, did not merely announce a new enemy. It revealed a fundamental miscalculation at the highest level of German strategy. Across Berlin, the public learned of the declaration through radio bulletins, and newspaper extras rushed onto the streets. Some citizens reacted with disbelief, others fell into quiet dread. Memories of food rationing, bombardment, and the social collapse of 1918 resurfaced with painful clarity. For the younger generation, many of whom had embraced the promises of Nazi ideology, the news was confusing but energizing. For older Germans, it was foreboding. Inside the Chancellery, the silence eventually gave way to hurried activity. Generals and ministers assembled to discuss implications, but the tone of the room had changed. What just hours earlier had been a confident war council now felt like the beginning of an enormous, unintended escalation. Hitler himself remained subdued. Those who observed him noted an absence of triumph or celebration. He appeared reflective, even troubled, contemplating the vast reality of a conflict that now stretched far beyond Poland. The morning of September 3rd marked the moment Europe slipped irreversibly into the Second World War. And for Adolf Hitler, it was the moment he realized that the war he had planned, a quick, localized campaign in the East, was on the verge of becoming a catastrophic global struggle. In the moments following Britain's declaration of war, the atmosphere inside the Reich Chancellery thickened into something almost physical. Several ministers and military officers stood awkwardly near the walls, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. The ticking of a clock, normally drowned by voices and movement, now seemed unnaturally loud. Adolf Hitler remained seated on the long upholstered sofa, motionless. His hands rested on his knees, his expression rigid and unreadable. The room's witnesses would later recall this silence as one of the most unsettling moments of their careers. Albert Speer, who had entered the room only minutes earlier, described the scene in striking detail years later. Hitler sank into himself. He did not rage. He did not shout. He sat there as if paralyzed, staring straight ahead. For a leader known for theatrical gestures, explosive anger, and commanding presence, this stillness was extraordinary. It was as if the news had stripped away the layers of confidence he had meticulously cultivated. Historians believe that Hitler's frozen reaction stemmed from a sudden awareness that one of his core strategic assumptions had collapsed. For years, he had insisted to his generals, to his diplomats, and perhaps most importantly to himself, that Britain would never again commit to a full-scale European war. He believed the British Empire was overstretched, that its leaders were divided, and that the trauma of 1914-1918 remained too fresh. He had misread not only British resolve, but also the political currents that had been shifting beneath the surface. In that room, on that morning, the consequences of this misjudgment began to unfold. When the silence finally broke, it did so tentatively. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, stood near the doorway. He had been one of the loudest voices assuring Hitler that London would not intervene. Now, seeing the Führer's expression, he appeared pale and unsure. Several accounts place Ribbentrop quietly asking, "And what now?" A question that revealed the depth of his miscalculation. Hitler reportedly turned his head slowly toward him, his eyes cold, and replied, "Now we have to see this through." The words were not angry, they were resigned. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the OKW, the High Command of the Armed Forces, stepped forward, offering a stiff, almost ceremonial assurance that Germany's military strength could withstand any coalition. But Hitler did not respond with enthusiasm. Keitel faltered mid-sentence, realizing that the tone of the room had shifted from confidence to apprehension. Around them, aides carried telegrams and intelligence briefings, unsure whether to hand them over. The entire chain of command seemed suspended, waiting for Hitler's next move. The invasion of Poland was still proceeding swiftly, but the broader implications became clearer by the minute. Germany was no longer engaged in a localized eastern campaign. It was now at war with one of the world's most formidable naval and imperial powers. Hitler's stillness gradually gave way to a quiet, reflective posture. Those present noticed that he seemed older, as if the weight of the news had physically settled onto his shoulders. According to later testimony, he whispered something that only those closest could hear. "If the war is lost, may God have mercy on us." The comment was brief, but its meaning was unmistakable. It was not an admission of defeat, but a recognition of the risks that now surrounded him. Outside the Chancellery walls, Berlin continued to absorb the announcement. Radio stations interrupted music and local reports to broadcast repeated bulletins. Crowds gathered around public speakers as Chamberlain's message played again and again. For many Germans, especially those who had lived through the First World War, the news felt like a return to a nightmare they had hoped would never revisit the nation. For younger citizens raised in the rhetoric of Nazi strength, the moment was confusing but electrifying. National Socialist propaganda had promised an era of renewed German power. War, to them, was proof of that momentum. Inside, however, Hitler was not celebrating. He rose slowly from the sofa, paced across the floor, then paused to look at a map of Europe pinned to the wall. Witnesses said he stared at the map for an unusually long time, tracing his finger along Britain's outline, then across the French border, and finally toward the Atlantic. It was as if he were calculating the scale of the conflict he now faced. Though his outward calm returned, the earlier silence had already revealed a profound internal shift. He did not shout at his ministers. He did not unleash blame. His reaction was deeper, more personal. He had underestimated the British will, and in doing so, he had initiated a war that might no longer follow his timetable or his vision. The war Hitler wanted, a swift campaign against Poland, followed by diplomatic pressure in the West, was over. A new war had begun, one whose scale he had not fully anticipated. Those in the room could sense it. Germany had stepped onto a path that could no longer be abandoned or reversed, and at the center of that moment stood a man who, for the first time in years, appeared uncertain of what would come next. As the shock of Britain's declaration settled over the Reich Chancellery, the corridors transformed into a flurry of hurried footsteps and hushed conversations. Secretaries carried fresh intelligence reports, teleprinters clattered with updates from Poland, and military officers assembled in the conference room for what would become one of the most tense meetings of the early war. Adolf Hitler, now composed but visibly strained, entered the room shortly after noon. The door closed behind him, and the men inside prepared for a discussion that would reshape Germany's strategic direction. Seated around the table were the key figures of the German war machine: Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the OKW, General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations, Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, and several senior officers from the Wehrmacht. The mood was brittle. It had been expected, almost taken for granted, that Britain would maintain its tradition of balancing diplomacy with caution. Yet the ultimatum of September 1st and the declaration of war on September 3rd shattered that belief completely. Hitler stood at the head of the table, staring down at a set of maps showing Poland, Western Europe, and the Atlantic sea lanes. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, but edged with restrained anger. He demanded to know how such a miscalculation had been allowed to happen. The room shifted uneasily. No one wanted to be the first to answer. It was Ribbentrop who first stepped forward, though hesitantly. For months, he had assured Hitler that Britain would not fight. He had argued that internal political divisions in London, combined with the memory of World War I, would prevent any meaningful military response. Now, cornered by his own predictions, he attempted to soften the situation. He suggested that Britain's declaration was largely symbolic, meant to maintain appearances, and that the British might still be open to negotiation once Poland fell. Hitler's response was immediate and icy. Several witnesses would later recall him turning sharply toward Ribbentrop and saying, "You promised me they would not fight." The accusation hung in the air. Ribbentrop faltered, searching for words. He muttered something about British public opinion and political pressure, but Hitler cut him off. The Führer's voice rose, not to a shout, but to a clipped, furious tone. "You were wrong. All of you were wrong." Keitel attempted to intervene, emphasizing Germany's military strength and the rapid progress in Poland. He argued that a quick victory in the east might still influence Britain's position. If Poland collapsed within days, as seemed likely, London might reconsider the necessity of a prolonged conflict. German forces, he added, were in peak condition. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. The army's mechanized units were performing even better than expected. Strategically, Germany still held the initiative, but Hitler was not reassured. The Eastern campaign was no longer the only concern. A war with Britain meant a war with the British Empire, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and potentially even India. Worse still, Hitler understood the geopolitical implications. A Britain at war increased the likelihood that the United States, still officially neutral but politically sympathetic to London, might become indirectly involved through economic and industrial support. The meeting intensified as officers presented logistical assessments. Britain's naval blockade, something Germany had suffered under during the First World War, was expected to be reinstated. The fleet of U-boats was still too small to counter the Royal Navy, and Germany's navy had only recently begun rebuilding after years of restrictions. Hitler listened closely. The consequences were becoming clearer. Germany would face not just a land war, but a maritime one. It was not yet prepared to fight. Maps were shifted, pencils scribbled, and voices clashed as the generals debated next steps. Should Germany accelerate its Western preparations? Should the Luftwaffe pressure Britain immediately? Should diplomatic channels remain open or be closed entirely? The discussion was frenetic but tense. Everyone spoke with urgency, but no one dared to contradict Hitler directly. Throughout the exchange, Hitler paced the length of the room. His movements were sharp, impatient. Several times he paused to stare at the map of Western Europe, tracing the border between France and Germany with his finger. There was a sense that his mind was already turning toward a broader conflict, a war far greater than the one he had planned. Yet one theme dominated the entire meeting. Britain's involvement had caught the German leadership completely unprepared. Toward the end of the session, Keitel once again sought to stabilize the tone. He reiterated that Germany's armed forces were strong enough to handle a prolonged conflict, and that the coming victory in Poland would demonstrate German resolve. Hitler finally stopped pacing and looked at him. His answer was quiet, but heavy. "The war will be long, longer than any of you expected." With those words, the meeting ended. The generals filed out, each carrying a sense of unease. Hitler remained alone in the room for several minutes, standing before the large map pinned to the wall. The enormity of the situation had sunk in. The war he had envisioned, a swift blow in the east, followed by a diplomatic settlement in the west, was gone. In its place stood a conflict that would engulf continents and alter the world. For the first time since coming to power, the German leader confronted the possibility that the war he had unleashed might evolve far beyond his control. As afternoon settled over Berlin on September 3rd, 1939, the German people waited for a voice, any voice, from their government. Radios crackled in tens of thousands of apartments, cafes, workshops and factory floors. Many listeners sat motionless, eyes fixed on wooden receivers, as if the machines themselves could reveal what the future held. Outside, the city remained unusually subdued. Berlin was a capital accustomed to rallies, parades, and triumphant announcements, but on this day, uncertainty weighed heavier than any celebration. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler prepared to address the nation. It was not a speech he had planned, nor one he had wanted to deliver. His earlier expectations that Britain would hesitate, delay, or negotiate had vanished. The declaration of war by Great Britain required a response, not only to reassure the public, but to frame the situation in ideological terms. The Nazi propaganda machine depended on controlling the narrative, and Hitler knew that silence was impossible. In a small studio prepared for radio broadcasts, technicians adjusted microphones and checked the acoustics. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, stood nearby, whispering last-minute suggestions and watching Hitler with calculating eyes. Goebbels understood the psychology of mass communication better than almost anyone in Europe, and he knew that the nation needed to hear strength, clarity, and purpose, even if the leadership itself had been shaken hours earlier. When the red recording light flickered on, Hitler leaned toward the microphone. Gone were the roaring cadences of his rally speeches, the dramatic pauses, and the triumphant crescendos that had electrified crowds for years. His voice, when it emerged, was calmer, colder than usual. Those who later listened to the archived broadcast often remarked on the difference. It was not a speech of confidence. It was a speech of justification. He began by framing Germany as the victim. He claimed that the invasion of Poland had been forced upon the Reich by alleged Polish provocations, claims widely dismissed by historians as fabricated or exaggerated. He insisted that Germany had acted for its own security and that Britain had chosen war despite the Reich's supposedly peaceful intentions. In Hitler's narrative, the Western powers were determined to destroy Germany once again, invoking memories of the First World War and the perceived injustices of the Treaty of Versailles. Throughout the address, his tone remained measured. There was no celebratory declaration, no boast about military strength. The excitement that had accompanied earlier political victories was entirely absent. Instead, the speech carried a heavy, almost resigned cadence. Eyewitnesses later noted that Hitler appeared physically drained as he spoke, his voice lacking the emotional fire that had long been his trademark. Yet the content was carefully designed. He spoke of unity, discipline, and sacrifice, words chosen to prepare the German population for a conflict far broader than anything they had been told to expect. He reminded listeners of the glory of the German nation, the duty of its citizens, and the necessity of facing enemies on multiple fronts. Though he never admitted the strategic disadvantage, his emphasis on endurance betrayed a subtle acknowledgement of the situation's gravity. Across Germany, reactions varied. Younger citizens, shaped by years of propaganda, responded with enthusiasm or patriotic fervor. Many believed the Reich unstoppable. But older Germans, who remembered the starvation winters of 1917 and the collapse of 1918, listened with dread. They recognized the cautious undertones in Hitler's speech and understood what those tones implied. The war would be long, and it would be costly. Meanwhile, foreign diplomats stationed in Berlin observed the address with great interest. Those who understood German noted the stark change in tone compared to Hitler's usual bravado. Reports sent back to London, Paris, and Washington described a leader sounding more defensive than triumphant. Some analysts speculated that Hitler had been genuinely surprised by Britain's resolve. Others believed the speech reflected a strategic attempt to appear calm while preparing for a massive mobilization. Inside the Chancellery, as the broadcast concluded, Hitler stepped away from the microphone and removed his headphones. Goebbels praised the speech, calling it strong and necessary, though his private diary entries reveal a more complex assessment. He sensed the shift in Hitler's energy and understood the precariousness of the situation. The propaganda minister was skilled at detecting mood, even in his own leader. Shortly after the address, Goebbels ordered newspapers, posters and bulletins to reinforce the narrative Hitler had presented. Headlines the next morning proclaimed British aggression, Polish treachery and German resolve. But beneath the official messaging, ordinary citizens whispered fears and speculated about what the declaration of war would truly mean. The trauma of 1914-1918 was never far from memory, and the knowledge that Britain was once again an enemy sent waves of anxiety through the population. Hitler, for his part, returned to his private office. The broadcast had fulfilled its purpose, but he remained unsettled. Several aides noticed he avoided meeting their eyes. His earlier silence, followed by his restrained anger with his generals, had revealed a deeper truth. Even though Germany had initiated the conflict, Hitler had not anticipated this version of the war. His speech had been an attempt to control the narrative. But the historical reality was clear. Britain's declaration had shifted the conflict onto a global stage, and nothing, neither rhetoric nor propaganda, could undo that. When night fell over Berlin on September 3, 1939, the city was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Streetcars still ran, cafes still served customers, and newspapers continued to roll off the presses. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. The German people had heard Adolf Hitler's speech, and although it had been crafted to project calm determination, it could not disguise an uncomfortable truth. Germany was now at war with Great Britain. Inside the Reich Chancellery, the aftermath of this turning point unfolded behind closed doors. Hitler, having delivered his broadcast and met briefly with his closest advisors, withdrew into his private study. Several staff members observed that he spent a long time standing by the window, looking out toward the Tiergarten. It was a warm evening, but the room felt cold. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on him. A war against Poland had been expected, planned meticulously over months, but a war against Britain was something else entirely. Reports continued to pour in from across Europe. The German invasion of Poland had achieved remarkable early success. Blitzkrieg tactics, coordinated, fast, and overwhelming, were proving effective. Yet victory in Poland, no matter how swift, would not resolve the crisis triggered by Britain's intervention. Hitler understood this. He had fought in the First World War, had lived through Germany's collapse, and had spent years cultivating a worldview in which Britain was a potential partner, not an unavoidable enemy. That assumption was gone, and with it, a foundation of his long-term strategy. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl held late-night discussions in an adjoining room. They reviewed logistical reports, fuel reserves, ammunition stocks, and transport timetables. Germany's military resources were strong, but not limitless. The Navy remained small compared to the Royal Navy. The U-boat fleet was still growing and far from capable of challenging Britain's control of the sea. A prolonged war would strain Germany's economy and supply lines, something every officer in the room understood, even if they hesitated to say it aloud in Hitler's presence. Yet the most revealing document of that night came from Goebbels' diary. In it, he noted, "The Führer is unusually quiet. He knows the gravity of this war. London has forced his hand." It was one of the few moments in the early war years where Goebbels, normally unwavering in his portrayal of Hitler's strength, hinted at vulnerability. Elsewhere in Berlin, reactions varied dramatically. Some citizens emerged from their apartments waving flags, singing patriotic songs, and expressing confidence in the Wehrmacht. National Socialist propaganda had long promised a revival of German power, and to many, the declaration of war simply confirmed that Germany was rising again. But quieter voices, especially among older generations, felt something very different: dread. They remembered the shortages, the inflation, the grieving families, and the ruins of 1918. For them, this new war was not a moment of national destiny, but the beginning of another long nightmare. In military circles, planning continued through the night. Officers debated the immediate and long-term implications. Could Britain mount a meaningful attack on Germany? Not yet. Could Germany strike Britain directly? The Luftwaffe had not developed a strategy for a sustained air campaign, and the Kriegsmarine lacked the ships for an invasion. A rapid offensive into France was discussed privately, but no final decisions were made on that first night. Yet one thing was clear: the war had become a European conflict, not a regional one, and the United States, still officially neutral, watched from across the Atlantic with growing concern. President Roosevelt had already strengthened ties with Britain through trade and communication. Though America had no intention of entering the war at that moment, Hitler understood that a prolonged struggle could draw the United States closer to Britain's side. He mentioned this to Keitel in passing, asking how long until they involved themselves. The question went unanswered because no one in the room possessed a reliable answer. As midnight approached, Hitler ordered updated military briefings for the morning. Then, almost abruptly, he dismissed his staff. According to later accounts, he walked alone through the dim corridors of the Chancellery, a solitary figure at the center of a rapidly widening conflict. The man who had once spoken confidently of remaking Europe now faced a war that was expanding beyond any single nation's control. In those final hours of September 3rd, the truth had become clear, even if no one dared say it aloud. Germany had entered a war for which it was not fully prepared, against an enemy it had not expected to fight, at a moment when its strategic plans were still incomplete. Hitler's ambition, once focused and deliberate, now collided with a geopolitical reality he had not foreseen. The decision he had made 2 days earlier to invade Poland had unleashed forces beyond his control. Britain's declaration of war transformed a campaign into a continent-wide struggle, and although Hitler would later regain confidence as Germany achieved quick victories in 1939 and 1940, the events of this day marked a turning point in his inner world. For the first time, Adolf Hitler had been forced to confront the possibility that the war he had begun might not follow his script, and that the consequences might eventually reach far beyond the borders of Europe. If this story helped you understand a decisive moment in world history, I invite you to support the channel. Leave your like, because it helps this video reach more people. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes and the hidden chapters of the Second World War that we still need to explore. Your support keeps this work alive.